Adolf Hitler was one of the most evil people in history. It's not even debatable. And if you think otherwise, then you should check your history books. But even though he was undeniably evil, Hitler still made mistakes. In fact, some of his decisions were so bad that they ended up costing him the war. So today we are gonna go over 5 deadly decisions by Hitler that altered the course of history. Number 5. Breaking into Poland. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler broke into Poland with an invasion force of 6 million soldiers. This attack was one of the deadliest in modern history, and it quickly overwhelmed the Polish military, which only had about 1 million active soldiers. The Poles fought back bravely, but within just 2 weeks, the German army had captured all of Poland and had divided it up between themselves and their ally, the Soviet Union. At first, this move seemed like a brilliant idea for Hitler because it gave him the territory he had always wanted, and it also made him very popular in Germany. However, things took a turn when France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. While these two countries didn't do much to help Poland, they still technically owned Poland, so attacking them was technically an act of war. Hitler had hoped that France and Great Britain would stay out of the conflict, but unfortunately he was wrong. And this turned out to be a massive mistake because the combined forces of France, Great Britain and Poland were simply too strong for the Germans to handle. They soon pushed the Germans back all the way to the North Sea. If Hitler had just left Poland alone, he likely wouldn't have gotten into this war at all, which is why it comes in at number 5 on this list. Number 4. The Night of the Long Knives. On June 30th, 1934, Hitler ordered the arrest and execution of his own top military officials. These men included Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the Sturmabteilung, or SA for short. These men were known as brown shirts due to the color of their uniforms, and they were basically Hitler's personal bodyguards. Hitler originally got along well with the brown shirts, and he used them to gain power during the early days of the Nazi Party. But once he came into power, he began to see them as a threat to his regime. He believed that the brown shirts were becoming too powerful and that they could eventually overthrow him. So he decided to get rid of them once and for all. However, this turned out to be a huge mistake because many of these men were loyal Nazis who had helped Hitler come into power. By getting rid of them, Hitler lost a lot of support among the German people. Not only that, but it also sent a message to other potential enemies that he was willing to get rid of anyone who he saw as a threat, no matter how loyal they had been to him in the past. This led to a lot of paranoia and mistrust within the Nazi Party, and it ultimately weakened Hitler's regime. Number 3. The failure in Moscow. On October 1941, the German army invaded the Soviet Union and quickly made their way to the capital of Moscow. At the time, Moscow was one of the most important cities in the Soviet Union, and capturing it would have dealt a devastating blow to their war effort. However, the German army was unable to capture the city, and they were eventually forced to retreat. This turned out to be a major turning point in the war, as it marked the beginning of the end for the German army. From this point on, the German army was never able to advance further into the Soviet Union, and they were eventually pushed all the way back to Germany. There are a few reasons for why the German army failed to capture Moscow. First, the Soviets were able to mount a strong defense of the city. Despite being outnumbered, the Soviet army was able to hold off the German army long enough for the harsh Russian winter to set in. This made it impossible for the German army to continue their advance. Additionally, the German army was not prepared for the Russian winter. They did not have the proper clothing or supplies to withstand the cold weather, which ultimately led to their defeat. Finally, the German army was overconfident. They believed that they were invincible and that they would easily be able to capture Moscow. This overconfidence led to a number of tactical blunders that ultimately cost them the battle. One of the biggest mistakes made by Hitler during this battle was his decision to declare war on the United States. This made the Soviets much more likely to fight back against the Germans, and it ultimately led to the collapse of the German army. If Hitler had just left Moscow, he likely wouldn't have gotten into this war at all, which is why it comes in at number 3 on this list. 2. Losing the Battle of Britain. After conquering most of Europe, Hitler set his sights on Great Britain. He believed that a quick invasion would be enough to force the British to surrender, which would effectively give him control over all of Western Europe. However, Hitler underestimated the British people. The British were able to mount a strong defense against the German air raids, and they were eventually successful in driving the Germans back. This battle would come to be known as the Battle of Britain, and it was one of the most important battles of the entire war. If the Germans had won, it's likely that they would have been able to invade Great Britain and possibly win the war. However, the British victory in this battle was a major turning point. It showed the world that the Germans were not invincible and that they could be defeated. This led to a number of countries that were occupied by the Germans, such as France and Belgium, to begin a resistance movement against the Germans. Additionally, the British victory in the Battle of Britain led to the development of radar, which would eventually be used to track enemy aircraft. Radar would eventually play a major role in winning the war. So if Hitler had just left Great Britain alone, he likely wouldn't have gotten into this war at all, which is why it comes in at number 2 on this list. Number 1. The invasion of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, German forces launched a massive attack on the beaches of Normandy, France. What became known as D-Day was one of the most ambitious military operations in history, and it involved soldiers from Great Britain, Canada, the United States, and several other countries. The Allied forces landed in Normandy with the goal of opening a second front in the war against the Germans. They hoped to quickly make their way to Berlin and end the war. However, the Germans were able to mount a strong defense, and the Allies were not able to capture Berlin for another year. This turned out to be a major turning point in the war, as it marked the beginning of the end for the German army. From this point on, the German army was on the defensive, and they were eventually pushed all the way back to Germany. There are a few reasons for why the D-Day invasion turned out to be such a disaster for the Germans. First, the Germans were able to mount a strong defense of Normandy. Despite being outnumbered, the German army was able to hold off the Allied forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Additionally, the Germans had a large number of tanks and other heavy weapons in the area, which they used to great effect against the Allied forces. Finally, the Germans were able to take advantage of the Allied supply lines, which were stretched thin, to keep their troops supplied with food and ammunition, which eventually led to their defeat. If Hitler had just ignored the Allied forces, he likely wouldn't have gotten into this war at all, which is why it comes in at no. 1 on this list. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. We've got lots of awesome videos coming up, so if you want to be sure not to miss them, don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.